The moment Richard Hayes saw his daughter clutch her stomach and stumble backward against the marble kitchen counter, he knew something had broken in the perfect world he'd built. His 15-year-old daughter Emma, the only light left in his life since her mother died 3 years ago, looked up at him with eyes filled with terror and confusion, and in that single second, everything he believed about safety and control shattered like glass. Richard Hayes had built an empire worth $4 billion from nothing. The son of a factory worker from Ohio, he'd clawed his way through business school on scholarships, created a revolutionary software platform that transformed healthcare data systems, and watched his company's stock price climb to heights that made analysts speechless. His mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut sat on 12 acres of manicured grounds, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Long Island Sound. He had everything money could buy, except the one thing he wanted most, his wife back. Cancer had taken Margaret when Emma was only 12, and since that day, his daughter had become his entire world. Every decision, every business move, every waking moment orbited around ensuring she had the life her mother would have wanted for her. Emma had always been healthy. She swam competitively, maintained straight A's at her private academy, and had her mother's bright smile that could light up a room. She was careful, responsible beyond her years, and had never given him a moment of worry. That's why the sudden change terrified him so completely. It started with fatigue about 2 weeks ago. Emma, who normally bounded down the stairs each morning ready to attack the day, began moving slowly, complaining of exhaustion that sleep didn't fix. Then came the nausea. She'd skip breakfast, pick at lunch, and Richard would find her in the bathroom late at night, pale and shaking. He'd immediately called their family physician, Dr. Morrison, who ran standard blood work and found nothing alarming. Probably stress from the upcoming school exams, the doctor had suggested. Maybe a stomach bug going around. Give it time. But time only made it worse. Emma's clothes began fitting differently. Her school uniform skirt that had been loose now strained at the waist. Her face, once bright and youthful, took on a drawn, anxious quality that made Richard's chest tighten with fear every time he looked at her. She stopped swimming, stopped seeing her friends, and spent more time in her room with the door closed. When he'd ask what was wrong, she'd shake her head and say she didn't know, that she just felt different, wrong somehow. The confusion in her voice haunted him during sleepless nights when he'd stand outside her bedroom door, listening to make sure she was breathing. Then this morning, he'd found her in the kitchen, doubled over, her hands pressed against her abdomen. The look on her face wasn't just pain. It was horror. Pure, unfiltered horror, as if her own body had betrayed her in ways she couldn't understand. Richard had immediately scooped her into his arms, feeling how thin she'd become despite the swelling in her midsection, and rushed her to his Mercedes. Within 20 minutes, they were at Greenwich Hospital's emergency department, where his name and wealth guaranteed immediate attention. Teams of doctors surrounded Emma within minutes, ushering her into examination rooms while Richard paced the hallway, his $2,000 Italian shoes squeaking against the polished floor. The initial tests came back inconclusive. Her vital signs were stable, but something was clearly wrong. The attending physician, a stern woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, recommended a full workup including ultrasound imaging, comprehensive blood panels, and hormonal analysis. Richard agreed to everything, signed every consent form without reading, and made it clear that money was no object. Whatever Emma needed, she would have. The best specialists, the most advanced technology, the most thorough investigation modern medicine could provide. He'd already lost his wife. He would not lose his daughter. As Emma was wheeled away for imaging, Richard stood alone in the sterile corridor, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened window. Outside, the September sun was setting over the hospital parking lot, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Margaret would have loved. He thought about calling his assistant to cancel tomorrow's board meeting, then realized he didn't care about the board meeting or the merger talks or the stock price or any of it. None of it mattered if Emma wasn't okay. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a number he hadn't called in months. Grace Williams. His housekeeper. She'd been with their family for 8 years, a quiet black woman in her mid-50s who'd helped Margaret through her final months and had stayed on afterward to help with Emma. Grace had a way with his daughter that Richard envied. Where he fumbled with words of comfort, Grace seemed to understand instinctively what Emma needed. Where he tried to solve problems with money and resources, Grace offered presence and patience. He'd been meaning to give her a raise, maybe even a bonus for her loyalty, but kept forgetting in the chaos of running his company. The call went to voicemail. Richard left a stammered message about Emma being in the hospital, nothing serious hopefully, just tests, he'd update her soon. His voice cracked on the word, hopefully, and he ended the call abruptly, embarrassed by his own vulnerability. Billionaires didn't crack. Billionaires stayed strong. That's what Margaret used to tell him during her treatment, even when her own strength was failing. Be strong for Emma, she'd whispered the night before she died. Promise me. When Dr. Chen emerged from the imaging suite 2 hours later, her expression made Richard's blood run cold. She gestured toward a private consultation room, the kind with soft lighting and tissue boxes strategically placed, the kind where they delivered devastating news. Richard's legs felt like concrete as he followed her inside, bracing himself for words like cancer or tumor or terminal. He'd heard those words before. He'd watched them destroy his wife. He couldn't hear them about his daughter. But the words Dr. Chen spoke were somehow worse than any he'd imagined, and as they left her lips, Richard felt the floor disappear beneath him, felt his perfect world crack apart, felt everything he thought he knew about his daughter and his life and his ability to protect what mattered most collapse into ash. The doctor's next sentence would change everything, would send him spiraling into a nightmare he never saw coming, would force him to question everything about the girl he'd raised and loved and would die to protect. The ultrasound images on Dr. Chen's tablet screen showed something that couldn't be real, something that made absolutely no sense, and yet there it was in grayscale clarity that left no room for doubt or denial or any of the desperate explanations Richard's mind scrambled to construct. "Mr. Hayes, I need you to sit down," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone who delivered terrible news hundreds of times. Richard remained standing, his hands gripping the back of the leather chair so tightly his knuckles went white. "The imaging shows that Emma is approximately 4 months pregnant." The word pregnant hit him like a physical blow. For several seconds, Richard couldn't process it. Couldn't make the word connect to his daughter, his 15-year-old daughter who'd never even had a boyfriend, who studied and swam and came home every day after school, who he knew, who he protected, who couldn't possibly be pregnant because that would mean she'd been lying to him, hiding things, living a secret life he knew nothing about. It was impossible. Completely, absolutely impossible. "No," Richard said, the word coming out strangled. "That's not possible. You've made a mistake. Run the tests again. That's not my daughter. You've mixed up the results." Dr. Chen's expression remained steady, patient. "We've run multiple confirmations. The hormonal markers are definitive. The ultrasound clearly shows a developing fetus. I understand this is shocking news, Mr. Hayes, but she's 15 years old." Richard's voice rose, echoing off the consultation room walls. "She's a child. She doesn't even date. She's never mentioned any boys. She's at school or at home, always. There's no time, no opportunity, no." He stopped, his mind racing through the past months, searching for signs he'd missed, clues he'd been too busy or too trusting to notice. Had there been someone? Some boy at school? Some secret relationship she'd hidden from him? The thought made him sick. Made him feel like he'd failed Margaret's memory, failed to protect their daughter the way he'd promised. How could he not have known? How could his brilliant, responsible, innocent daughter have gotten pregnant and never said a word? And with whom? The questions multiplied faster than he could process them, each one more painful than the last. "I need to speak with her," Richard said abruptly, pushing past Dr. Chen toward the door. "I need to talk to Emma right now." "Mr. Hayes, wait," Dr. Chen called after him, but he was already in the hallway, striding toward the examination area where they'd left Emma. His mind spun with rage and betrayal and fear. Not rage at Emma exactly, but at whoever had touched his daughter, violated her, taken advantage of her youth and innocence. When he found out who was responsible, they would pay. He'd destroy them legally, financially, personally. No one hurt his daughter and walked away. He found Emma in a recovery room, sitting on the examination table in a hospital gown, her legs dangling over the edge. She looked so small, so young, her dark hair falling across her face as she stared down at her hands. When she heard him enter, her head snapped up, and the expression on her face stopped him cold. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't shame or defiance or any of the emotions he'd expected. It was pure, bewildered terror. "Dad?" Her voice came out small and broken. "What did they say? What's wrong with me?" Richard opened his mouth to confront her, to demand answers, to ask how this happened and who was responsible, but the words died in his throat. Because as he looked at his daughter, really looked at her, he saw something that made all his anger evaporate into confusion. She didn't know. Whatever the doctors had found, Emma genuinely had no idea what was happening to her body. The fear in her eyes wasn't the fear of being caught in a lie. It was the fear of the unknown. "Emma," he said carefully, moving closer, "the doctors say you're pregnant." The word hung in the air between them. Emma's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally something that looked like panic. "What? No. No, Dad, that's impossible. I've never. I haven't." Tears began streaming down her face. "I don't understand. How could I be pregnant? I've never even kissed anyone. I swear to you, I swear on Mom's memory, I've never been with anyone like that. Never." Richard searched her face for deception and found none. His daughter, who'd inherited her mother's inability to lie convincingly, was telling the truth. He knew it in his bones. Which meant either the doctors were wrong, or something else was happening, something he didn't understand. "The ultrasound showed," he began, but Emma cut him off. "I don't care what it showed. I'm telling you the truth." Her voice rose, bordering on hysteria. "I've never had sex, Dad. Never. I know what that means. I know how pregnancy happens. And I'm telling you it didn't happen to me. So either their machines are broken or I'm dying of something else, but I'm not pregnant. I can't be." Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, her expression troubled. "Mr. Hayes, I'd like to bring in a specialist. Dr. Robert Walsh is our head of obstetrics. He has extensive experience with unusual cases. Perhaps a second opinion would be helpful." "A second opinion?" Richard felt his control slipping. "My daughter just told you she's never been sexually active. Doesn't that matter? Doesn't that factor into your diagnosis at all?" "In medicine, we rely on objective evidence," Dr. Chen said carefully. "The imaging and blood work are clear. However, I understand this is difficult, and Dr. Walsh may be able to provide additional clarity." Over the next 3 hours, Richard watched his daughter endure examination after examination. Dr. Walsh confirmed the initial findings. Then they brought in Dr. Sarah Kim, a reproductive endocrinologist. She confirmed it too. Each specialist looked at the same images, ran the same tests, and arrived at the same impossible conclusion. Emma Hayes, 15 years old, virgin by her own tearful insistence, was somehow 4 months pregnant. By midnight, Richard had spent $40,000 on consultations and tests. Emma had been poked, prodded, scanned, and questioned until she could barely keep her eyes open. And still, no one could explain how a girl who swore she'd never been intimate could be carrying a child. The medical community offered no answers, only certainties that contradicted everything Richard knew about his daughter. As he drove Emma home through the empty Connecticut streets, his phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, his lawyers, his board members. He ignored them all. Nothing mattered except the girl sitting silently in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the darkness, her hands resting protectively over her swollen abdomen. She believed she was innocent. Richard believed her. But science didn't lie. And somewhere in that impossible contradiction, the truth was waiting to destroy them both, unless they could find answers that medicine apparently couldn't provide. The Greenwich mansion felt different when they returned that night, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of the impossible diagnosis and now pressed in with judgment and suspicion. Richard helped Emma upstairs to her bedroom, tucked her under the white down comforter she'd had since childhood, and watched her finally surrender to exhausted sleep before retreating to his study with a bottle of scotch he had no intention of drinking but needed to hold. Grace Williams found him there at 2 a.m, sitting in the dark behind his mahogany desk, the untouched scotch glass catching moonlight from the window. She'd let herself into the house with her key, something she rarely did outside normal working hours, but his voicemail had worried her enough to drive over from her apartment in Stamford. Grace was a solid, practical woman who'd raised 3 sons on her own after her husband died young, who'd worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families across Connecticut for 30 years, and who'd learned to read people the way others read books. She took one look at Richard's face and knew something had broken. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly from the doorway, "what happened?" Richard looked up, registering her presence with dull surprise. "Grace. You didn't need to come. Your message said Emma was in the hospital." "Of course I came." She moved into the room, her movements quiet and efficient. "Is she all right? Where is she?" "She's asleep." Richard's voice came out hollow. "The doctors say she's pregnant." The words felt surreal even saying them out loud. Grace's hand went to her chest, her expression shifting through shock to confusion to something Richard couldn't quite identify. "Pregnant? Emma? But that's..." She trailed off, her mind clearly working through the same impossibilities Richard had been wrestling with for hours. "She swears she's never been with anyone," Richard continued, the words tumbling out now that someone was there to hear them. "She looked me in the eyes, Grace, and swore on her mother's memory that she's never had sex. And I believe her. I know when my daughter is lying, and she's not lying. But the ultrasound shows a fetus. The hormone levels confirm it. 3 different specialists all agree. So how is this possible? How can both things be true?" Grace lowered herself slowly into the chair across from Richard's desk, her hands folded in her lap. "Sometimes doctors make mistakes," she said carefully. "Sometimes tests get mixed up, results get confused. Not like this. Not with this level of certainty." Richard ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration Margaret used to tease him about. "They're talking about DNA testing, about psychiatric evaluation, about whether Emma might have repressed memories of assault." His voice broke on the last word. "As if my daughter was attacked and somehow doesn't remember it. As if something that traumatic could just vanish from her mind." Grace was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying Richard with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "What does Emma say about how she feels? About her body?" "She says she feels wrong. Sick. Exhausted. Her stomach hurts, her back hurts. She doesn't understand what's happening any more than I do." Richard finally took a sip of the scotch, feeling it burn down his throat. "I'm taking her to specialists in Manhattan tomorrow. The best gynecologists in the country. Someone has to have an answer." "Mr. Hayes," Grace said slowly, "I've been caring for Emma since she was 7 years old. I've watched that girl grow up. I know her character, her spirit. And I'm telling you, she's not lying to you. I know she's not lying." Richard's voice rose before he caught himself, remembering Emma sleeping upstairs. "That's what makes this impossible. Either she's pregnant, or she's not. Either she's been with someone, or she hasn't. There's no middle ground here, Grace. Science doesn't work on faith. Grace leaned forward, her expression grave. What if it's not pregnancy? What if the doctors are seeing something on those images and making an assumption, but it's actually something else? A growth, a tumor, some kind of rare condition that looks like pregnancy but isn't? Richard had considered this. Had desperately wanted it to be true. They tested hormone levels. HCG, progesterone, all the markers that indicate pregnancy. They're all there, all elevated exactly as they should be for someone 4 months along. But you said Emma's never even kissed a boy. You know your daughter, Mr. Hayes. You know she's telling the truth. So maybe the science is right about what it's detecting, but wrong about what it means. Grace's voice carried a certainty that made Richard look up. Maybe this is something the doctors don't understand because they've never seen it before. Medicine doesn't work like that, Richard said, but even as the words left his mouth, he felt doubt creeping in. Because medicine hadn't been able to save Margaret either, despite all the specialists and treatments and experimental drugs he'd thrown money at. Medicine had limitations. Maybe this was one of them. The next morning brought a media nightmare Richard hadn't anticipated. Someone at Greenwich Hospital, some nurse or administrator who saw dollar signs in celebrity gossip, had leaked Emma's condition to a tabloid website. By 8 a.m., Richard's phone was exploding with calls from reporters wanting comments on the Billionaire's pregnant teen scandal. His lawyers were already drafting cease and desist letters, but the damage was done. The story was out, spreading across social media like wildfire, complete with speculation and judgment and cruel commentary from strangers who knew nothing about his daughter or their situation. Richard kept Emma home from school, kept her away from her phone and computer, tried to shield her from the ugliness. But she knew. Somehow she knew that people were talking about her, calling her a liar, assuming the worst. He found her in the bathroom that afternoon, scissors in hand, staring at her reflection in the mirror with dead eyes. "I want to cut it out," she whispered when she saw him in the doorway. "Whatever's inside me, I want it gone. I don't care what it is. I just want to feel normal again." Richard took the scissors gently from her hands, pulled her into his arms, and held her while she sobbed against his chest. His brilliant, beautiful daughter who'd done nothing wrong was being destroyed by circumstances neither of them understood, and all his billions couldn't fix it. Couldn't stop the tabloids, couldn't change the test results, couldn't make the nightmare end. That evening, Grace found him in Emma's room, sitting on the floor beside her bed while his daughter slept fitfully. The housekeeper had brought dinner neither of them had eaten, and now she stood looking down at them both with an expression Richard had never seen before. Determination. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly, "I think I know someone who might be able to help. Someone who understands things that regular doctors don't. It's unconventional, but—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "But if you're willing to try something different, something outside what hospitals can offer, I know a healer who might see what others are missing." Richard looked up at her, desperate enough to grasp at anything that might offer hope, terrified that this desperation would lead him down paths that would only make things worse for Emma. But as he watched his daughter sleep, her face tight with pain even in unconsciousness, he realized he'd already exhausted conventional medicine. Maybe it was time to try something else. Maybe it was time to trust the quiet housekeeper who'd stood by his family through Margaret's death and everything after, who loved his daughter almost as much as he did, and who'd never steered him wrong before. Grace's healer lived in a modest house in Bridgeport, a 40-minute drive from Greenwich that might as well have been a journey to another world. The neighborhood was working class, chain-link fences and vinyl siding, so different from Richard's estate that he felt conspicuous pulling his Mercedes to the curb outside a small blue ranch house with a vegetable garden in the front yard. Emma sat silently in the passenger seat, wrapped in an oversized hoodie despite the warm September afternoon, her hood pulled up to hide her face from potential recognition. "Are you sure about this?" Richard asked Grace, who'd insisted on accompanying them. He trusted her, but everything about this felt wrong. He was a man of science, of data, of quantifiable results. The idea of consulting some kind of traditional healer felt like admitting defeat, like abandoning reason for desperation. "Mr. Khalid helped my sister when the hospitals gave up on her," Grace said firmly. "He sees things others don't. Just give him a chance. For Emma's sake." The man who answered the door was not what Richard expected. Mr. Khalid was perhaps 70, with kind eyes and weathered hands, dressed in simple slacks and a cardigan. He greeted Grace warmly, like an old friend, then turned his attention to Emma with a gentleness that made Richard's defensive posture soften slightly. "Come in, child," Mr. Khalid said, his accent carrying traces of somewhere far from Connecticut. "Let's see what troubles you." The interior of the house was neat and sparse, decorated with photographs of family and shelves of old books. Mr. Khalid led them to a back room that served as his consultation space, asking Richard and Grace to wait outside. Richard started to protest, unwilling to let Emma out of his sight, but Grace touched his arm. "Let him work," she whispered. "He needs to examine her without interference." The 40 minutes Richard spent pacing the narrow hallway felt like hours. He could hear the low murmur of Mr. Khalid's voice through the door, asking Emma questions, though he couldn't make out the words. Several times he heard his daughter's voice responding, stronger than it had been in days. Whatever was happening in that room, Emma wasn't afraid. When the door finally opened, Mr. Khalid emerged alone, gesturing for Richard and Grace to join him in the modest living room. Emma remained in the examination room, resting, he explained. Richard's heart hammered as he sat on the worn sofa, bracing himself for more impossible news. "Your daughter is not pregnant," Mr. Khalid said simply, his voice carrying absolute certainty. Richard felt something release in his chest, hope and relief and confusion all colliding. But the tests, the ultrasound, showed something growing, yes. But not a child. Mr. Khalid folded his hands in his lap. "Emma has a condition we call a phantom mass. In Western medicine, you might call it a dermoid cyst, but this is more complex. It contains tissue that mimics pregnancy, produces similar hormones, grows in similar patterns. The body becomes confused, produces pregnancy hormones in response to the mass. This is why your tests showed what they showed." "A cyst?" Richard leaned forward. "Why didn't the doctors see this?" "They did ultrasounds, imaging. Because they were looking for pregnancy, so they saw pregnancy," Mr. Khalid said patiently. "The eye sees what it expects to see, especially when the signs point in one direction. But I have seen this condition before, many times in my years of practice. The symptoms are distinct if you know what to look for. The placement of the growth, the quality of the discomfort, the pattern of hormonal changes. It mimics pregnancy but it is not pregnancy." Grace let out a long breath beside Richard. "Can it be treated?" "Yes. It requires surgical removal, but it is not uncommon procedure. A skilled gynecological surgeon can remove the mass laparoscopic. Recovery is typically 2 to 3 weeks. Emma will be fine." Mr. Khalid's expression grew more serious. "But she will need surgery soon. The mass is growing, putting pressure on surrounding organs. Another month and it could cause serious complications." Richard's mind spun. A cyst. A treatable, explainable, non-pregnancy condition that could be resolved with surgery. It made sense. It explained everything: the positive pregnancy tests, the growing abdomen, Emma's insistence that she'd never been intimate. She was telling the truth. She'd been telling the truth all along, and the doctors had been so certain of their diagnosis that they'd never considered alternatives. "I'll need you to document this," Richard said, his voice steadier than it had been in days. "Write down your findings, your diagnosis. I'll take Emma back to the hospital, have them do new imaging specifically looking for a cyst rather than pregnancy. If you're right, if this is what's been happening, then we can schedule surgery immediately." Mr. Khalid nodded. "I will write everything down. But you should know, Mr. Hayes, that Western doctors may resist this diagnosis. They have invested pride in their original conclusion. You may need to be firm, insist on proper investigation of all possibilities. I'll be firm, Richard said grimly. He'd been too passive before, too trusting of expertise. Not anymore. Can I see Emma? His daughter was sitting on the examination table when Richard entered, looking more alert than she had in weeks. When she saw him, tears filled her eyes. Mr. Collett explained it to me, Dad. It's not a baby. I'm not pregnant. I told you. I told you I was telling the truth. Richard crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, feeling her shake with sobs of relief. I know, sweetheart. I know. I'm sorry I ever doubted you. I'm so sorry. I was so scared, Emma whispered against his shoulder. Scared that somehow I was wrong about my own life, that I was crazy, that I'd done something and couldn't remember it. The way those doctors looked at me, like I was lying, like I was just some stupid girl who got in trouble and wouldn't admit it. You're not stupid. You're not lying. And we're going to fix this. Richard pulled back to look at her. We're going to get you the surgery you need, and you're going to be fine. I promise you, Emma. You're going to be fine. On the drive back to Greenwich, Emma fell asleep in the passenger seat, her face peaceful for the first time in weeks. Grace sat in the back, quiet but satisfied. Richard gripped the steering wheel, his mind already racing ahead to the next steps. He'd take Mr. Collett's documentation to the hospital, demand they re-evaluate their diagnosis, find the best surgeon in the country to remove the cyst. He'd clear his daughter's name, make sure everyone who judged her knew they'd been wrong. But first, he needed to thank the woman who'd saved his daughter when medicine had failed. Grace Williams, his housekeeper, had seen what doctors missed. Had trusted her instincts when science offered false certainties. Had known someone who could provide answers when hospitals had only provided devastation. Grace, Richard said quietly, glancing at her in the rearview mirror, I can never repay you for what you've done for Emma. For what you've done for our family. Grace met his eyes in the mirror, her expression warm. Emma's like a daughter to me, Mr. Hayes. I'd do anything for that girl. All I want is to see her healthy and happy again. Still, Richard insisted, when this is over, when Emma's recovered, things are going to change. You've been part of this family for 8 years, but I've never treated you like family. That changes now. Whatever you need, whatever you want, it's yours. Grace smiled softly but said nothing, turning her attention back to the window. Richard didn't know it yet, but that promise would reshape all their lives in ways he couldn't imagine, would transform their household from employer and employee into something far more meaningful, would create bonds of loyalty and trust that wealth alone could never buy. But first, they had to prove that Mr. Collett was right, had to convince skeptical doctors to look past their original diagnosis and see the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Dr. Patricia Chen did not appreciate being told she'd made a diagnostic error, especially not by a billionaire who'd consulted what she called an unlicensed folk healer, instead of trusting medical expertise. When Richard returned to Greenwich Hospital the next morning with Mr. Collett's documentation and demanded new testing, her professional courtesy evaporated into barely concealed irritation. Mr. Hayes, I understand you want different answers, but ultrasound imaging doesn't lie, she said, her voice tight with controlled frustration. They stood in the same consultation room where she delivered the pregnancy diagnosis 3 days earlier. We showed you clear evidence of a developing fetus. Multiple specialists confirmed the findings. You can't simply shop around for a diagnosis you prefer. I'm not shopping around, Richard said, fighting to keep his own temper in check. Emma sat beside him, her hood pulled up, her eyes fixed on the floor. I'm asking you to consider an alternative explanation. This healer suggested my daughter might have a dermoid cyst that's mimicking pregnancy symptoms. Is that medically possible? Dr. Chen's expression shifted slightly, annoyance giving way to something that might have been thoughtful consideration. Dermoid cysts can produce unusual hormone patterns, she admitted slowly. But the imaging we did would have shown. Would have shown what you were looking for, Richard interrupted. You were looking for pregnancy, so you interpreted the images as pregnancy. I'm asking you to look again, this time considering the possibility of a cyst. Silence stretched between them. Richard could see Dr. Chen's internal struggle, pride warring with professional responsibility. Finally, she sighed. I'll order a transvaginal ultrasound and an MRI. If there's a cyst, we'll find it. But Mr. Hayes, if the results confirm our original diagnosis, I need you to accept that and start making appropriate plans for Emma's care. The transvaginal ultrasound required Emma to endure more invasive examination, more strangers discussing her body like she wasn't in the room, more humiliation and discomfort. Richard held her hand throughout, whispering reassurances he desperately hoped were true. The technician performing the scan kept pausing, zooming in on particular areas, her expression growing increasingly puzzled. I'm seeing something unusual, she finally said, glancing at Dr. Chen who'd stayed to observe. The structure I initially identified as gestational sac has irregular borders. And there's tissue differentiation that's inconsistent with typical fetal development. Dr. Chen moved closer to the screen, her professional mask cracking to reveal genuine surprise. Run it again. Focus on the cellular composition. 2 hours later, Richard sat with Emma in the consultation room while Dr. Chen reviewed results with a radiologist and an oncological specialist. When she finally returned, her expression was carefully neutral, but Richard caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested discomfort. The MRI reveals a complex mass consistent with a mature cystic teratoma, commonly called a dermoid cyst, Dr. Chen said, her voice professional but strained. It contains multiple tissue types including hair follicles, sebaceous material, and what appears to be partially formed tooth structures. The mass has been secreting hormones that triggered false positive pregnancy markers. Emma's hand squeezed Richard so hard it hurt. So I'm not pregnant? No, Emma. You're not pregnant. You never were. Dr. Chen had the grace to look directly at the girl when she said it. I apologize for the distress our initial diagnosis caused. This is an unusual presentation, and we should have investigated more thoroughly before reaching conclusions. Relief flooded through Richard so powerfully he felt dizzy. Emma began crying, great heaving sobs of release and vindication. She'd been telling the truth. The world had doubted her, judged her, called her a liar, and she'd been telling the truth all along. What happens now? Richard asked when he could trust his voice. The mass needs to be removed surgically. I'd recommend Dr. Sarah Morrison at Yale New Haven Hospital. She specializes in complex gynecological surgeries and has extensive experience with teratomas. The procedure is laparoscopic, relatively low risk, but it needs to happen soon. The mass is substantial and continuing to grow. Richard nodded, already pulling out his phone to contact the surgeon. Can you provide documentation of the correct diagnosis? Something I can share with Emma's school, with the media outlets that published stories about her? Dr. Chen's expression flickered with something that might have been shame. Of course. I'll have a full report prepared by end of business today. And Mr. Hayes, again, I apologize. We should have considered all diagnostic possibilities before settling on pregnancy. Yes, Richard said coldly, you should have. My daughter has spent days believing her body betrayed her, believing she was somehow wrong about her own experiences, enduring judgment from strangers and doubt from people who should have trusted her. An apology doesn't undo that damage. They left the hospital with Emma's vindication documented in medical reports and surgical scheduling paperwork. Richard immediately contacted his legal team, instructed them to demand retractions from every outlet that had published stories about the pregnant teen scandal, and authorized them to pursue legal action against the hospital employee who'd leaked confidential medical information. Grace was waiting when they arrived home, having prepared Emma's favorite meal despite knowing the girl probably wouldn't eat much. When she saw their faces, saw the relief and exhaustion and lingering trauma, she simply opened her arms. Emma went to her immediately, collapsing into the housekeeper's embrace like a child. "Mr. Khalid was right," Richard told Grace over Emma's head. "You were right to take us to him. The doctors confirmed it's a cyst, exactly as he said. Emma needs surgery, but she's going to be fine." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Thank God. Oh, thank God." That evening, Richard sat in his study writing thank you notes, something he hadn't done since Margaret died. One to Mr. Khalid, expressing gratitude that felt inadequate for the service he'd provided. One to Grace, though words on paper couldn't capture what her instincts and loyalty had meant to his family. And one to Emma, apologizing for every moment he'd doubted her, for every second she'd spent feeling alone in her terror. The surgery was scheduled for the following week at Yale New Haven. Dr. Sarah Morrison, a woman in her 50s with steady hands and kind eyes, met with them to explain the procedure. She'd reviewed all of Emma's imaging and confirmed the diagnosis. The teratoma was large but entirely accessible. Barring complications, Emma would be home within 2 days and fully recovered within 3 weeks. "These growths are benign in the vast majority of cases," Dr. Morrison explained, "but we'll biopsy the tissue to be certain. You're very fortunate it was caught before it caused more serious complications. Another few months and it could have twisted on itself, cutting off blood supply. That would have required emergency surgery and potentially caused permanent damage." Richard listened, calculating how close they'd come to disaster, how easily this could have ended differently if Grace hadn't intervened. If she hadn't known Mr. Khalid. If she hadn't trusted her instincts over medical authority. His daughter's life had been saved not by the most expensive doctors or the most advanced hospitals, but by a housekeeper who cared enough to look beyond conventional answers, and by an elderly healer working out of a modest house in Bridgeport who understood conditions that modern medicine had dismissed. The night before Emma's surgery, Richard found Grace in the kitchen preparing meals to stock the freezer for Emma's recovery period. He watched her work for a moment, this woman who'd been part of his household for 8 years but who he'd never really seen until now. "Grace," he said, "I meant what I said before. When Emma's recovered, things are going to change around here. You're not just the housekeeper anymore. You're family." Grace looked up from the casserole she was assembling, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Hayes, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." Richard moved into the kitchen, leaning against the counter. "You saved my daughter's life. You saw what I couldn't see, trusted what I didn't trust, fought for her when I was ready to accept the doctor's word as gospel. That kind of loyalty, that kind of love, deserves more than a paycheck." "I love that girl," Grace said simply. "That's all the reward I need." But Richard was already planning, already restructuring his understanding of family and obligation and what really mattered in life. The surgery would succeed, Emma would recover, and when she did, everything would be different. Better. Built on gratitude and trust and recognition of what truly saved people, which wasn't money or power or prestige, but love and loyalty and the courage to question authority when authority was wrong. The surgery lasted 4 hours, every minute of which Richard spent pacing the surgical waiting room at Yale New Haven Hospital like a caged animal. Grace sat calmly in one of the uncomfortable chairs, her hands folded around a worn Bible she'd brought from home, her lips moving in silent prayer. Richard envied her faith, her ability to surrender control to something beyond herself. He'd spent his entire adult life believing he could solve any problem with enough money and determination, and the past 2 weeks had shattered that illusion completely. When Dr. Morrison finally emerged, still in her surgical scrubs, Richard's heart stopped. But the smile on her face sent relief cascading through him so powerfully his knees nearly buckled. "The surgery went perfectly," Dr. Morrison said, pulling down her mask. "We removed a teratoma roughly the size of a grapefruit. It had embedded itself near the ovary but hadn't caused permanent damage to any reproductive organs. Emma will make a complete recovery and should have no long-term complications. Richard actually felt tears on his face, something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's funeral. Grace was beside him suddenly, her hand on his arm, steady and warm. "Can we see her?" she asked. "She's in recovery now, still sedated. Give her another hour, then you can visit. She'll be groggy, but she'll know you're there." Dr. Morrison's expression grew more serious. "We sent the tissue for biopsy as a precaution, but preliminary examination shows no signs of malignancy. I'm confident this was entirely benign." The relief was so complete Richard had to sit down. Emma was okay. His daughter was okay. The nightmare that had consumed the past 2 weeks was finally over. She'd been vindicated, proven truthful, saved from a diagnosis that had threatened to define and destroy her. And she'd emerged on the other side stronger, having learned that sometimes the people who love you see truth more clearly than supposed experts. Emma looked impossibly small in the recovery room bed, surrounded by monitors and 4 lines, her face pale against the white pillows. But when Richard took her hand, her eyes fluttered open, and the smile that crossed her face was pure and unguarded, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "Hey, Dad," she whispered, her voice rough from intubation. "Did it work?" "It worked perfectly, sweetheart. It's gone. You're going to be fine." Tears slipped down Emma's cheeks, disappearing into her hair. "I wasn't crazy. I wasn't lying." "No, baby. You weren't. You were telling the truth all along, and I'm sorry anyone ever doubted you." Richard squeezed her hand gently. "Grace is here too. She's been praying for you all morning." Grace moved to the other side of the bed, her weathered hand covering Emma's free one. "You did so well, sweet girl. So brave." "You saved me," Emma said, her eyes finding Grace's face. "The doctors were wrong, but you knew. You found someone who could help when nobody else could." "I just listened to my heart," Grace said softly. "And my heart said you were telling the truth." The 3 days Emma spent recovering in the hospital, Richard barely left her side. He fielded calls from his assistant about missed meetings and delayed projects, authorized his CFO to handle the quarterly earnings report, and generally let his $4 billion empire run itself while he focused on what actually mattered, his daughter's recovery. Board members expressed concern. His lawyers wanted strategic discussions about the defamation lawsuits he'd threatened against the hospital and media outlets. Richard ignored them all. Grace brought home-cooked meals, sat with Emma when Richard needed to step out, and filled the hospital room with warmth that the sterile medical environment desperately needed. Watching them together, Richard realized something he should have understood years ago. Grace wasn't just an employee who happened to care about Emma. She was a mother figure who'd helped raise his daughter through the worst period of their lives, who'd been there for every milestone and struggle since Margaret's death, who'd earned a place in their family that had nothing to do with her job description. When they finally brought Emma home 5 days after surgery, the mansion felt different. Richard had spent Emma's hospital stay making changes. He'd converted one of the guest suites on the 2nd floor, the one with views of the Sound and its own sitting area, into a bedroom for Grace. He'd informed her that same afternoon, while Emma slept peacefully under post-operative care, that she was no longer living in her apartment in Stamford. "You're moving in here," he'd said, in a tone that brooked no argument. "Emma needs you close during recovery, and honestly, Grace, we both need you. This house has been missing something since Margaret died, and I think it's been missing you being properly part of it instead of just visiting during work hours." Grace had protested at first, said it wasn't necessary, that she was happy to come by daily to help with Emma's recovery. But Richard had been insistent, and eventually, she'd agreed, moved by his sincerity and by her own love for Emma. Emma's recovery progressed smoothly. The incision sites healed well, her energy gradually returned, and within 2 weeks she was moving around the house without pain. The biopsy results came back negative, confirming the teratoma had been entirely benign. Dr. Morrison cleared her to return to school after 3 weeks, though Richard and Emma both agreed she'd finish the semester with private tutoring at home instead. The media attention had died down after Richard's lawyers forced retractions and public apologies, but the damage to Emma's reputation at school would take time to heal. The private tutors Richard hired were excellent, but it was Grace who really helped Emma recover emotionally from the trauma. She'd sit with Emma in the afternoons, talking about everything and nothing, sharing stories from her own life, treating the girl like an equal rather than a fragile patient. Grace had a way of making Emma laugh that Richard had never mastered, a ease with emotional complexity that came from raising 3 sons through their own teenage dramas. One evening, about a month after the surgery, Richard found Emma and Grace in the kitchen making Margaret's famous chocolate chip cookies from a recipe his late wife had perfected over years of experimentation. They were laughing over some shared joke, flour dusting Grace's dark hands and Emma's younger ones as they worked together, and the sound of Emma's genuine joy stopped Richard in the doorway. This was what family looked like. Not the polished, perfect image he'd tried to maintain after Margaret's death. Not the sterile mansion with its expensive furniture and careful distance between employer and employee. But this, people who loved each other, working together, laughing together, healing together. Grace had given them this. Had saved Emma's life, and in doing so had saved Richard from the isolated, grief-driven existence he'd been sleepwalking through for 3 years. "Grace," he said, interrupting their baking, "I need to talk to you about something." Both women turned, Emma's expression curious, Grace's wary. Richard pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, the paperwork he'd had his lawyers prepare over the past week. "I'm restructuring Emma's trust fund," he said, handing the envelope to Grace. "Margaret and I set it up when Emma was born, to ensure she'd be taken care of if anything happened to us. I'm adding you as a co-trustee with full access and decision-making authority until Emma turns 25. Grace's eyes widened. "Mr. Hayes, I can't." "You can and you will," Richard said firmly. "You've proven you'll protect Emma's best interests even when it means challenging medical authority or challenging me. That's exactly who should have legal authority over her future. And there's more." He pulled out a second envelope. "This is a deed to the house in Bridgeport you've been renting. It's yours now, free and clear. You can live here with us, which is what Emma and I both want, or you can keep the Bridgeport house as a retreat. Your choice. But either way, you're family now, Grace. Legally, financially, and in every way that matters." Tears streamed down Grace's face as she opened the envelopes, saw the legal documents that transformed her life. Emma moved to embrace her, and Richard found himself pulled into the hug, the 3 of them standing in the kitchen surrounded by the smell of baking cookies and the warmth of genuine love, and for the first time since Margaret died, Richard felt like their family was whole again, just different than before, built on gratitude and loyalty and the recognition that family isn't always defined by blood, but by who shows up when you need them most. 6 months later, on a bright March morning, Richard stood in the sunroom watching Grace and Emma tend the garden they'd started together that spring. Emma, now 16 and healthy, had thrown herself into learning about plants with the same intensity she applied to everything. Grace taught her patiently, sharing knowledge passed down from her own grandmother, and together they transformed a neglected corner of the estate into a thriving vegetable garden that supplied their kitchen with fresh produce. The changes in their household over those 6 months had been profound. Grace now lived permanently in the converted guest suite, though she'd kept the Bridgeport house and occasionally spent weekends there when she needed solitude. Her sons visited regularly, bringing grandchildren Grace doted on, and the mansion that had felt hollow and cold after Margaret's death now rang with the noise of extended family gatherings, children's laughter, and the chaos of real life. Emma had returned to school in January, walking through the doors of her academy with her head high despite lingering whispers. Most of her classmates had moved on to new gossip, but a few remained cruel, making comments about the pregnancy scandal that had never actually been real. Emma handled it with grace that made Richard proud, correcting misinformation calmly and refusing to engage with those who preferred salacious stories to truth. Her best friend Sophie, who'd stood by her throughout the ordeal, helped shield her from the worst of it. The legal fallout had been significant. Richard's lawyers had successfully sued 3 tabloid publications for defamation, winning settlements he'd immediately donated to organizations supporting survivors of sexual assault and teenage health advocacy. The hospital employee who'd leaked Emma's medical information had been fired and faced criminal charges for HIPAA violations. Greenwich Hospital had settled a lawsuit with a public apology and funding for a new patient privacy training program. Dr. Chen had written a personal letter to Emma apologizing for the diagnostic failure, which Emma had graciously accepted. But the most significant change was in Richard himself. The billionaire who'd once believed every problem could be solved with money and power had learned humility. He'd scaled back his hours at the company, promoting his COO to handle day-to-day operations while he maintained strategic oversight. His board had been concerned until the stock price actually rose, responding positively to signs that their founder was achieving better work-life balance and delegating effectively. Richard had also begun volunteering with a foundation supporting access to healthcare for underserved communities, inspired by Mr. Khaled's work in Bridgeport. The elderly healer had refused payment for helping Emma, but Richard had donated $500,000 to renovate the community health center where Mr. Khaled volunteered, ensuring other families could access the kind of holistic care that had saved his daughter. Emma had insisted on visiting Mr. Khaled monthly to thank him personally, and a genuine friendship had developed between the teenage girl and the elderly healer. He taught her about traditional medicine, about listening to what bodies communicate beyond what tests can measure, about trusting intuition alongside science. Emma had declared her intention to become a doctor, but one who integrated conventional and traditional approaches, who listened to patients instead of dismissing their experiences. "She's going to change the world," Grace said quietly, appearing beside Richard at the sunroom window. They stood together watching Emma explain something about companion planting to one of Grace's granddaughters, her hands animated, her face bright with enthusiasm. "She already has," Richard replied. "She changed mine, anyway. This whole experience changed everything." Grace nodded, understanding without need for elaboration. The trauma that could have destroyed Emma had instead revealed the depth of love and loyalty that existed in their household, had transformed employer-employee relationships into genuine family bonds, had taught Richard that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought but had to be earned through trust and vulnerability. "I've been thinking," Richard said, turning to face Grace directly, "about what Margaret would think of all this. Of you living here, being part of Emma's life so completely, being part of our family." Grace's expression grew thoughtful. "Mrs. Hayes was a good woman. I think she'd be pleased Emma has someone who loves her the way I do. I think she'd be more than pleased. I think she'd be grateful." Richard paused, choosing his words carefully. "Margaret asked me to be strong for Emma before she died. I thought that meant being financially successful, providing every material advantage. But watching you these past months, I've realized strength isn't about money or control. It's about showing up with love even when situations are difficult. It's about trusting your instincts when everyone else says you're wrong. It's about fighting for people you love even when the system pushes back. You showed up for Emma when it mattered," Grace said gently. "You believed her when the doctors didn't. You listened when she said she was telling the truth. Only after you pushed me to consider alternatives. Only after you brought Mr. Khaled into our lives. You saved her, Grace. And you saved me from becoming so isolated in grief that I lost connection with what family really means." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Emma and the children work in the garden. Finally, Grace spoke again. "Emma wants to throw a dinner party next month for her birthday. She's asked to invite Mr. Khaled, my sons and their families, some friends from school. She wants everyone she loves in one place." "Then that's what we'll do," Richard said immediately. "Whatever Emma wants." The dinner party, when it happened in April, filled the mansion with life and noise and joy that Richard hadn't experienced since before Margaret's illness. Mr. Khaled sat at the head of the table, treated as an honored guest and telling stories that had everyone laughing. Grace's sons and their families mixed easily with Emma's school friends, the barriers of age and background dissolved by genuine warmth. Sophie gave a toast thanking everyone for supporting Emma through her ordeal, and Emma herself stood to say words that left hardly a dry eye in the room. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over, she said, her voice steady despite emotion. I thought I was going crazy, that my body had betrayed me, that nobody would believe the truth. But I learned something important. I learned that family isn't just who you're related to by blood. It's who shows up when you need them. It's who believes you when the whole world says you're lying. It's who fights for you even when fighting is hard. She looked directly at Grace. Grace, you saved my life. You trusted me when you had every reason to doubt. You found help when hospitals failed. You loved me like I was your own daughter, and I want you to know that's how I see you. As family. As someone I love and trust and am grateful for every single day. Then Emma turned to her father. Dad, I know this has been hard for you too. Losing Mom, almost losing me, learning that money can't fix everything. But you showed up. You believed me. You changed our whole life to make room for what really matters. I'm proud to be your daughter. The applause was thunderous, but Richard barely heard it. He was too busy watching his daughter, healthy and strong and surrounded by people who loved her, and feeling gratitude so profound it was almost painful. They'd been through hell together, his small family. They'd faced impossible odds, fought against medical certainty, trusted faith over science when science failed them. And they'd emerged stronger, bound together by trials that revealed the true depths of loyalty and love. Later that night, after the guests had left and Emma had gone to bed, Richard found Grace in the kitchen cleaning up. He picked up a dish towel and started drying without asking, working beside her in companionable silence until the work was done. Thank you, he said finally, for everything you've done for us. For Emma. For me. For making this house feel like a home again. Grace smiled, the kind of smile that held wisdom and kindness and understanding. You gave me a family too, Mr. Hayes. My boys are grown, living their own lives. I was lonely before this, before you asked me to stay. So thank you for that. For letting me love Emma. For trusting me with what matters most. They stood together in the quiet kitchen, employer and employee no longer, but family in the truest sense. Outside, the March wind rustled through the trees Margaret had planted years ago, and somewhere in the house, Emma slept peacefully, her body healed, her spirit stronger, her future bright with possibility. The nightmare that had nearly destroyed them had instead revealed what they were made of, had stripped away pretense and pride to expose the bedrock of love underneath. They'd survived together, grown together, and built something new from the ashes of trauma. A family defined not by blood or marriage or employment contracts, but by loyalty, trust, and the fierce determination to protect what matters most even when the whole world says you're wrong.